Hi, my name is Dr. Avi Herskowitz, and I want to thank you for joining me today, Thursday, January 19th, for this webinar looking at the state of the art of COVID infection in the United States, as well as controversies in terms of vaccination and boosters and what we can do to prevent disease and so on. I want to also say that, as a disclaimer, that what I'm going to say now is not meant to be a level of a consultation on the medical side. Anyone that has a serious question should seek medical care by a professional, and also is my own personal opinion on all the subjects that I'm going to be discussing. So thank you again for joining me, and let's get started. I'm going to share some slides first and build on a two-day conference that we ran back in November as an ACAM meeting on long COVID. I had to review the history of the virus, and the reason I wanted this session here is to just update everybody, not so much to review everything about the history, but to review what the science shows today, not the theories, and just to debunk some of the theories that are out there. Back in November, we gave a sort of a tour of the state of the art of where we were, and we focused a lot on long COVID, and long COVID seems to stabilize. But now, as the winter came, all the media and all the attention came onto the booster world, and I wanted to deal with that at great length. But let me first give a context, because I think some of the most important features of this experience and lessons learned from the pandemic come actually from its history and how it started, and what we began to learn right away. And what we knew back 3 years ago was that the best possible scenario would be is that you would catch the COVID-19 and get natural immunity. Now, that was very scary because the first wave that hit the United States, particularly the East Coast, was from Europe. The first big wave, I think in the West Coast, we had a wave even before the spring of 2020, but natural immunity was the way to go. And we knew that the virus attached to the ACE2 receptor, which is preferential to the upper respiratory system. And it was well understood what it does. So we understood that certain people would be at risk and certain people would pass away. And we also felt from the beginning that children would be largely protected. And the data came out fairly quickly. So this is March of 2020, where, as you recall, the wave of death and morbidity happened in New York in particular that got the most attention. Well, we knew right away that the huge bulk of the population that was affected was in the elderly population. And although I'm not going to show it, this is the population that also had 3 or more comorbid conditions. And what I mean by that is hypertension, prediabetes or diabetes, prior history of heart disease or prior history of stroke. And this is back from the data from November of 2020. This is 8 months into the pandemic. We knew that the older population was the most affected. And what you can see here is that the younger population under 45 was barely a blip in the mortality information. But as you remember, the Delta variant was scary because it tended to make the ill patients very ill and got them into respiratory failure. And not only was that potentially fatal, it left so many people in the earliest wave with a great deal of long-standing pulmonary or lung problems. But this is what we knew already, that the elderly were affected, the young were relatively protected, and that the patients, the people out there with comorbid conditions, were the ones that were mainly affected. Okay. Now, this is where the immunology comes in. Now, this very, very basic stuff. There's basically no clear correlation between immune function and protection, and that's because we don't measure the things that we need to measure. So what we're measuring is the easy material. The easy stuff is antibodies, because we can measure. We know how to measure antibodies, and the assays were developed immediately after the pandemic started. But everyone that gets a viral infection of any kind will develop antibodies to that infection, to that virus, to some component of that virus, and some of those antibodies are neutralizing, or they're capable of killing the virus on their own. But it's also completely normal for the antibody levels to decline. So if you're only measuring antibody levels, which is what the government decided to do, and what the authorities decided to do, then if you argue that lower antibody levels are bad for you, then that's just simply a normal the normal pattern the normal pattern of behavior for everyone with a viral infection of any kind, let alone COVID-19. So the decline in that is not a great marker, and we noticed that different populations in the hospital had varying populations of antibodies. What was the main thing was how much viral load you actually had been exposed to, and how long it took you to develop these antibodies, meaning how long did the virus itself have on its own to injure cells, particularly in the respiratory tract. And then everybody who has a viral infection develops antibodies first, and then T cells. And those lymphocyte cells are the ones that give you permanent immunity. And we never developed the testing for those T cells until very late, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But basically, we're measuring the wrong tool that only can tell you whether you've been exposed. It doesn't tell you how sick you're going to be, or what your complication rates are going to be. So when you look at the experts that talked about this, they said that there were assays that could be developed to understand T cell specific or lymphocyte specific immunity that would gauge how long you will be protected after getting exposed to the virus. But it was just too complicated to do. This is a quote from, I believe, the NIH. So based on the hypothesis that the old people, the high risk patients should be focused on, and so on, and the ACE2 receptor is well known, and natural immunity is best. We then get to the current world, and this slide comes from back in November, so it's a few months old. So we understand that even after the Delta variant is long gone, and now Omicron in November has taken over, and that's when the BA4 and 5 variants were big, and they're no longer the key variants any longer, because they've fundamentally changed again. But severe complications from the virus are due to persistent and abnormal immune reactions, and the virus is already gone by the time you get really ill from it. So who is currently in the hospital? Who do you see in the hospital from with a viral infection from COVID-19? Who's in the intensive care unit? It tends to be the elderly, and the majority of people dying now are above the age of 80, and they have comorbid conditions, and they can't handle the high fever and the cough and the various things, the various stressors that it puts the rest of the body on. But by November, the big news of the day was to talk about the mystery of long COVID, and we were talking about two full days of analysis of what it looks like and how you could theoretically treat it, like other disorders that we in the integrative world see, like Lyme disease and chronic fatigue syndrome and so on. But we understand that long COVID may be due and is likely to be due to, in many patients, to persistence of the spike protein. And that means whether you've been exposed just to the virus or also exposed to the boosters and the vaccines, elicited a state of autoimmunity. That's been my expertise for the last 30 plus years, so I can answer any questions regarding this. And this bucket called long COVID is actually composed of multiple buckets of people, and I'd be happy to talk about it at length. Today is not going to be the day where we're going to completely focus on it. So why did we do so poorly in the United States? Well, we focused only on vaccines. We had no serious public health discussion about how to prevent complications from something that would affect the ACE2 receptor. And that the majority of Americans are metabolically unhealthy, and this comes from governmental data. Roughly a third of the population of our entire population of adults have diabetes or prediabetes. And any country that has this type of population will have a lot more problems from COVID-19 based on the way it enters the body. And this may explain why the Asians and the Africans have done so much better than people from the West. So back in November, we did focus that ACAM meeting on long COVID, and it was already taken up by this magazine and many others in terms of as personal stories of a neglected disease, much like chronic fatigue and chronic Lyme. But what we noticed with that is that some people who were actually asymptomatic when they first got ill with the virus, or they never had the virus and just had the vaccines, it was enough to trigger autoimmune reactions, and they still can develop long COVID. That means you didn't have to be really, really ill with COVID infection, or you could have remained either asymptomatic or never had documented COVID infection and still get long COVID. But it does, and we started seeing patients about a year or so ago with diseases with symptoms that looked like fibromyalgia, that looked like chronic fatigue, that looked like chronic Lyme, that looked like mold. And they also started having patients who were very sensitive to the environment, so-called mast cell activation syndrome, and people with POTS, P-O-T-S, which is this postural tachycardia syndrome, which is very debilitating and very difficult to treat, but we can get into that later. But the two things that we worried about early on were things that were really first noted in people who were hospitalized. So people that were hospitalized who got better on their own, or got better after a stint in the ICU, they had longer-term brain problems, whether it's a stroke or something really focal, or it was just I just have a serious brain fog. But we understood that there was something going on specific to the brain and the vascular system, but it did affect many patients in their cognitive function. And then the other thing that we focused on at the meeting, and I'll focus a little bit on today, is the link between the virus and heart problems of varying kinds. So in JAMA, back in about a year or so ago, they started noticing extra cardiovascular outcomes. And so if you take all comers, 1,000 people, and this includes the youngsters too, who don't have inherent comorbid conditions, they don't have prediabetes, they don't have hypertension and so on, so they're at lower risk. You had many, many new cardiovascular events. The one that's the most dramatic, of course, is heart attack and sudden cardiac death, and I'll get into that in a minute. But we've also seen, and we see patients like that here at Anatara, not infrequently, sudden cardiac death with some people have been fortunate enough to be resuscitated. Others dramatically die with that presentation. But we also have atrial fibrillation and other types of events like congestive heart failure that comes silently, so to speak. So we see all of these things, and it's been now shown in many different ways that these particular brain and cardiac problems are increased and began increasing in 2022 rather than 2020 or 2021. And that leads to the argument that much of these extra events, adverse events, are occurring and still occurring due to the vaccines and the boosters rather than to the virus itself. So this isn't the beginning of 2022. So this is a year ago. The Europeans started saying, wait a second, I think that it's sort of silly to start giving boosters every few months. And it may actually weaken the immune system because the immunology data started to show a suppression of the immune system to future variants of COVID. And then the Israelis reported that the fourth vaccine dose, meaning the two RNA doses, either from Pfizer or from Moderna, and two additional boosters, didn't do very much different than just the original vaccination, what benefit the original vaccination gave. But of course, the safety profile was still said to be very, very, very strong. And yet right now we're going to dispel some of that. And so the body is not a machine that feeds well on repeated exposure to the same antigen that isn't life-threatening, and eventually it becomes suppressed to that infection. And I'll explain in a minute how we know this. So this happened. We all have heard the gold standard in medicine is the NEJM, the New England Journal of Medicine, and this is back in the beginning of 2022. They said the following quotes from that article that came out, and that we should base our boosters on real scientific data and understand who needs it, and we shouldn't boost to a virus more than annually, and this is what the country does typically for flu, and that should be the soonest it can be done. And why don't we know exactly how often we should, if at all, get boosted? And that's because we're running the wrong tests. We're not running the test to say, basically, I had the virus or I have had a vaccine and I have lifelong immunity to it. And that lifelong immunity by lymphocytes is still quite active in me because I've done the test. So the improvement would end up to be to do different testing and ultimately get a better vaccine strategy in the first place that was developed. So over the course of this year, it's become crystal clear that the myocarditis situation is exploding, and we've seen it all on television with that football player who had sudden cardiac arrest on national television. And in my opinion, the number one potential cause of this is myocarditis, but it's not going to ever be proven in him. But the Moderna vaccine and boosters are a lot worse than Pfizer, but they're all noted, and you notice that the 16 to 24-year-old population is the most effective. So it's the youngsters who have exceptionally low risk for a complication from the virus itself that are then exposed to the vaccine that have this particular risk. And these are all the college-age students that have been forced to be vaccinated in order to go to school, and the high schoolers and so on. So this is now in the middle of, so towards the third quarter of 2022. It's now just a few, like 4 months ago. The new Omicron-specific vaccines don't seem to offer any specific extra protection to existing boosters. That means that to the boosters that were developed 1 to 2 years ago. And this has been repeatedly documented in many different studies. So, but it's very interesting in how they developed these particular boosters for the ones that they're currently suggesting that all of us get. And very few of us have gotten. I think less than 10% of the population has been boosted with the newest bivalent vaccines. So this is hard to read. I'll give you a little bit of time to read it. This is the main two bullets are the middle and the bottom bullet. So the original trials that got approval or emergency use authorization, they're not approved by FDA, were that we were told that they're 95% effective. First of all, the first real jump between effectiveness with essentially no emphasis on safety data. At that point, they only studied people for 2 or 3 months after the vaccines, but they said that 95% less likely to catch the virus, and then you basically have to vaccinate hundreds, if not tens of thousands of younger people in order to catch one symptomatic infection. But the main propaganda was that we would be able to protect others, and this was never tested. So the ability of the virus of the vaccine to even be called a vaccine had to force the FDA to change its definition. And the concept that it would protect you from giving it to others was never tested and has been, in my opinion, debunked from the current information that we have all through all the different variants. So, for example, when you have less than 1% of people get symptomatic infection, but then you realize that the majority, 80%, are above the age of 65, and the great majority of those have 3 or more comorbid conditions, you can understand if you're a healthy 30-year-old that you have to vaccinate many thousands of people in order to deliver one less symptomatic infection. So a recent paper, now this is more recent, this is a month or 2 old in Nature, there's a large increase in cardiac arrests. This is from Israel in the 16 to 39-year-old groups. So this is people who are not supposed to have sudden death or coronary disease. We have a large increase in this data. And now I believe in 2022 that these numbers will ultimately be related, if they're related to vaccination and to boosters, will become the leading cause of death in the younger population. Then we come up to January, and I just did a recent search on, I wrote into Google, are vaccines fueling new COVID infections? And whenever you try to alter the immune response to a virus, well, of course, you're going to get new viral variants. So you're going to produce more and more of them. That's what they do. But we've been always fortunate that future variants are usually less problematic than the original one was, which is, again, the case here. But then you get hits for the first time. And this is from, I think, the Wall Street Journal. So the Wall Street Journal is publishing these data. And it comes from an article that just came out literally, I think, 3-4 weeks ago from one of the senior virologists in the United States, Paul Offit. and he wrote the cautionary tale. This is in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he wrote that the Pfizer bivalent vaccine contains a certain amount of RNA message that directs against both the original strain, which is called ancestral strain, and the reason it's called bivalent is because it was approved based on also antigens directed against the BA1 strain. And Moderna used higher doses because it was equivalent to what they originally used in their original vaccines. So this is he's quoting what happened back in January and February. So I didn't realize this until I read this article that our current bivalent vaccines that have been approved are approved for BA4 and 5, but they were presented to FDA in January and February of 2022 using a different strain, BA1, which no longer is around and was no longer a problem even when they presented it to FDA. So they got approval anticipating a similar reaction and with the upcoming new variants, which were called BA4 and BA5. Well, even those variants are no longer hardly exist at all. But when they presented it to FDA in early 2022, again, they were a fairly underwhelming type of information. But the FDA advisory committee did vote to authorize it on the understanding that they would be targeting a different variant, BA4 and 5, which they hadn't even yet developed. So then the pharma and both Pfizer and Moderna started to develop the one specifically for BA4 and 5, but they had approval from FDA to go forward with it based on data that they showed in January and February of 2022 with a variant that no longer existed. And then the CDC went ahead and approved it for anyone 12 and over, and then they approved it for everyone that was in the infant population. But at that point, when CDC recommended it for everyone, basically, there was no human data available. And there still isn't any human data available from those particular studies that were done. And now we have a bivalent vaccine, a booster, to BA4 and BA5. But there's a few problems with that, and that is that and that's been highlighted in the more recent scientific literature. So David Ho is also a very prominent senior virologist, immunologist, and his colleagues studied the neutralizing antibodies against those BA4 and 5, and they found no differences between the original people who were originally vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2. And then one day later, in the race to get this data out, Dan Baruch, another very senior virologist, immunologist, released the same type of information. So basically, the new bivalent vaccines don't offer anything special and don't offer anything significantly different than the original boosters and the original vaccines. And the question is, why? Why is this? Why would that happen? And why is this the concept that certain people who are getting more and more of these boosters seem to be getting suddenly ill, whether it's cardiac or vascular related, different blood vessels getting occluded and different very serious illnesses occurring. All right, so let's see what's up. So this is probably the most important slide I want to show. This is something that many immunologists already knew would happen and predicted that this would happen. I focused a lot of things that I talked about at ACAM from March of 2020 on the fact that this will be a trigger, COVID-19 would be a trigger for autoimmunity, but didn't focus on this concept of imprinting, but then watched it unfold over time. And that is that when you get a vaccine against a specific virus, your immune system learns from that original set of mutations that it's targeting. And when you get future boosters to different variants off of the ancestral strain, you're still going to develop more and more antibodies against the older ancestral strain, the original strain. You're going to get very little new antibodies developing to the variant that you wish. And that's what happens when you boost people over and over again to things that are not that troubling to the immune system, and the immune system learns to ignore the new epitopes that you want it to focus on. And yet, again, the overwhelming majority of the population is at low risk from the new variants anyway. Again, both in Europe, where the data started happening before Christmas, before Christmas time, it showed that the average person in hospital in the United Kingdom was 83 and had 3 comorbid conditions, and now the same is being held true in the United States. So there's efficacy data that's only that's for 3 months or 8 months after receiving. There's a small amount of efficacy data comes from the CDC, but when you look at efficacy, when you say, well, what is effectiveness? Effectiveness is antibody levels. This is not not really having a big impact on the 80-plus-year-olds who get symptomatic infection that then leads to hospitalizations. This may be symptomatic infection that basically is like either a fairly run-of-the-mill flu or sometimes a more serious flu where you get fatigue, you get fever, you get aches and pains, and you may be out of pocket for a week, but then you will, if you're left alone, you will develop multi-year at least, or if not lifelong immunity. So right now we know that if there is any protection at all, it's going to be against mild disease, and it will be short-lived. And most of the population is now getting tired of listening to all the noise that's happening around us. And only about 10% of the population has been recommended, has already received these bivalent vaccines, and that's completely appropriate. And I think that the youngest population should avoid this at all costs. But right now, the last bullet is sort of key also. The bivalent vaccine is to BA4 and 5, but BA4 is no longer circulating in the United States, and BA5 is only a very small fraction. And now we're on to the BQs and the XBBs and the XBB1s. We're into the different strains, which, of course, is a normal thing, is a normal natural history of a viral infection. So we're chasing our tails and doing it with technology that is considered to be potentially fundamentally flawed in terms of how it interacts with our immune system and how it interacts with not only what's in the vaccine and what's used to activate the vaccines and so on, but it's also an mRNA technology that doesn't have an off switch in certain patients. It just, in certain people, the spike protein is continually produced and causes problems. So this is what the New England Journal says now. We shouldn't get booster doses if we're going to get them, we shouldn't get them more often than annually, and I don't see any purpose to getting the boosters at any point any longer. But if you're going to give it to some folks, you'll give it to the older adults with multiple coexisting conditions. The problem with this, even the first bullet here, that's a statement made by the most premier medical journal in the world, the problem with it is that it seems to be making people worse rather than protecting people. So so I would say I'm not sure from my own perspective whether I would vote to give the boosters to any particular group right now, unless I really made a really serious analysis of their risk. And we have to stop really trying to prevent symptomatic infections in healthy people by boosting them. That's a non-starter that cannot affect the natural history of the virus and will only produce more variants. So this is the latest stuff that's happened. I think this came from circulation this month, and they're basically saying the people with myocarditis have more spike protein in their bloodstreams than people who don't have myocarditis. So these are youngsters with myocarditis. Some of them don't have an off switch for the RNA to make more spike protein. And so there's a link between that myocarditis in teens and circulating levels of spike protein. And the next one is interesting. There's no correlation with antibodies against the virus or the T cell response to the virus, because it's got nothing to do with the virus per se. It's got to do with an autoimmune reaction to what's the constituents in the vaccine itself or the boosters themselves. So why would this happen, and what is the immunology behind it? Well, one of the main hypotheses now is when you study subgroups of antibodies called IgG, these are the long-standing antibodies. This G4 antibody is seen in people that have repeated vaccinations, and this is an antibody that is responsible as a turn off switch. So when the immune system is exposed continually to a foreign agent that is not lethal, it will stop targeting it vis-a-vis these types of regulatory IgG antibodies that tell the immune system to just forget about this antigen. So when you get exposed to a new variant, you disregard it. And what happens is you simply have higher viral levels in your throat, in your pharynx and larynx for a longer period. And then that's when you feel sicker from the flu than you would normally feel if you didn't get boosted. So this is the state of where we are. I don't think that there's any scientific information out there that suggests the value of boosters for the overwhelming majority of the population. And the RNA component, the mRNA component for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have simply not been tested for safety properly, and they won't be as long as they get approved by FDA for emergency use. And so what do? If I wanted to understand what someone's potential risk is, I look at things that we should be all being taught every day by the Public Health Service, and you look for predictors. And so I look for the master regulators of immune function, and I look at the vitamin D level as the one that's probably the most significant. I look at all the inflammatory markers. The D-dimer is a coagulation marker that's really been steadily elevated in very many patients after getting either just the virus and then disappears over time, but it's sticking around longer in people who've gotten the vaccines and have gotten the boosters. And we look at the surveillance immune system. It's called the natural killer cell population, the CD57 cells. And we look for absolute risk reduction by age, and we look for T cell reactions. And if you have T cells reactions to SARS-CoV-2, the original ancestral strain, then you already have the same amount of antibodies as you would have if you got a booster to the current strains, because they're just moving too rapidly. And so I look for who's at immunological disadvantage, so to speak. And then what we really needed in the United States, and the real lesson from COVID-19, was to reduce the comorbid conditions. So what are they? The prediabetes and hypertension and exposure to mold and heavy metals. The fact that we don't repair while we sleep and we don't sleep as well as we should, and our detox pathways aren't optimized. And this should be the most important lesson learned from COVID-19, but someone forgot to mention it to the Public Health Service. So I'm going to get off the sharing of the slides and get on to the Q&A, and I would thank you for your time. I know it took about a half an hour. It took longer than I thought. And we can take a Q&A from everyone if we wanted to, so you can put into the chat if you'd like. Right now we are seeing patients with post-vaccination POTS and autonomic disturbances and postural hypotension and states of sleep disturbances and folks that need anti-anxiety medicines and so on. A lot of neurological subtle stuff, but also severe complications like cardiac complications that we're seeing. So how do you protect yourself? That's we've sent out, I think 5 different times we've sent out a sheet that contained the natural antivirals. There is no current data on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine on these newer variants, so I have no specific opinion from it. But one of the next questions is, how are people detoxing from the constant spike creation in their cells? Well, that's where some patients, some colleagues and patients are going to be taking multiple months worth of ivermectin. What is the exact amount of time for this? We don't know, but we know that from some experiences with long COVID patients that my estimate is you'd have to take ivermectin for several months to deal with persistent viral proteins inside cells. And ivermectin is, I think, an improvement over hydroxychloroquine for that particular purpose as a preventative. But it's not been tested, but it's a very safe drug. So I think the number one thing you can do to protect yourself is ensure that your vitamin D level is elevated to 60 plus range, 60 to 80, or I have mine ideally in between 80 and 100. I think that's fundamentally important. How do you get antioxidants into your system that are working properly? So whether it's vitamin C or it's resveratrol or it's alpha lipoic acid or it's all nutrient based from foods, these are the best approaches. And our food supply is the biggest source of of inflammation in the body. So I would focus our attention on getting pure non-adulterated food from the farmers markets and so on. So there was one question on whether this extracorporeal blood oxygenation and ozonation, this thing called EBOO for vaccine injury. Well, there are a few centers, including ours, that are using EBOO and a stronger version of it, which we call plasma filtration, for vaccine injury, amongst other things. There's good results coming from this if you're willing to do it repeatedly. One session that filters the blood. What is in that filter? Well, we've shown during the meeting that we had in ACAM, we showed that we have fungus, we have bacteria, we have biofilm that's produced by these chronic organisms in the filter, which all are associated with inflammation. an active inflammation and would gunk up the microcirculation, and you wouldn't be able to get the positive nutrients and supplements downstream, and even the ivermectin downstream. So it is effective, but it may take 4, may take 8, may take 12 sessions from EBU in order to make a difference. And they usually couple EBU with chelation therapy. And I also thought that about a year or so ago that for Lynn Patrick in particular, but that this would be a boon for chelation therapy, because so many people have, as part of their comorbid conditions, they have exposure to mold, but they also have exposure to heavy metals, and this would be a renaissance period for chelation therapy, which I hope still takes place. From Andrew, what protocols am I recommending for long COVID symptoms such as insomnia? I think that's a subtle neurological effect, and on the autonomic nervous system, raising the sympathetic drive and suppressing the calming effects of the parasympathetic system. And I think we heard a lecture on specifically on the effects of CBD on affecting that system before one goes to sleep, or to use it around the clock for this level of insomnia. We also understand that our innate circadian rhythm has been off for decades now in most of us, but this unearths it, this unmasks that deficiency that we have. So wearing the appropriate blue light blockers at night, turning off our computers, reducing our EMF exposure, and then really getting into a very serious attempt for gut repair, because this is all made worse by any level of inflammatory signaling. The long COVID is an autoimmune state in many people, not in all, but in many people, and anything that activates the immune system will not be elegantly integrated into the system as it normally would be, and that therefore it gets unmasked. So those are and then of course the natural herbs that are used for insomnia. But this is becoming very, 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 very common in larger numbers of people, because larger numbers of people won't get multiple sclerosis symptoms. The large majority won't get a stroke. The large majority will get some subtlety. So I see that subtlety is on depression side, anxiety side, and raising the sympathetic tone of people who are on the edge. And then it manifests the most commonly in those of us, including myself, on the level of insomnia. I've heard about Paxlovid. Can we comment on it? So Paxlovid is an antiviral. It does reduce the viral load in the upper respiratory system. If taken within 5 days, I would say, why wait 5 days? If you have it and you're going to use it, you have to use it more rapidly to get the real effect. The real effect is to reduce the viral load and then reduce symptoms, therefore. But the downside is that you're going to suppress the natural immune system as well to the virus, and therefore you're going to be at risk to get the same strain again. So a lot of the most famous folks out there, including Dr. Fauci, took the Paxlovid and then got immediately ill right after they got over it. So if you're at really serious risk for just getting a flu, I would consider it. I would consider it seriously. At the same time, if you feel you could survive a regular flu, then I wouldn't use it. Okay. And if I currently recommend flu shots, well, I don't routinely recommend flu shots. And the question is why. The question is someone's mom wants to know. And again, it depends on the story. The story is, will they work? And typically they've always worked less than a third of the time they've gotten the antigens. They have to guess the antigens, so they haven't guessed correctly. And that triple thing of saying we're going to get COVID-19 in the winter and we're going to get the flu, and all the other viruses and so on hasn't panned out. So I haven't seen a lot of flu-related, non-COVID related serious problems. Again, you may feel crummy for a few days. What we have seen is reactivation of the chronic viruses in the body, and those are more serious. So reactivation of cytomegalovirus, of Epstein-Barr virus, of mycoplasma pneumoniae, and these things that live inside our cells for long periods of time throughout our lifetime, and it's reactivating the immune system's activity against them, even though they've been dormant for decades. Lyme activation, reactivation, Bartonella reactivation, and then mold activation in people who've been living with it for a long time and been in remission, have gotten iller and iller. So I don't routinely recommend the flu shots for our patients, but our patients are typically taking vitamin D, are typically taking an antioxidant of some kind, and understand why we want to eat quality, food and so on. So they have that level of understanding that they don't typically get that ill. Thank you for all your time and for the great questions. I hope I begin to answer some of them. And happy belated New Year to all of you, and blessings, and for a healthy and productive year, and also happy Chinese New Year for everyone who's listening as well. So I'm going to sign off now, and take care, everyone, good friends and new friends out there. Take care. Bye-bye.